Star Wars was, at its height, a beloved story in galaxy, enjoyed by mass audiences and a passionate fandom, a global phenomenon, the first and perhaps the archetypal movie franchise. It now languishes as a fallen angel of Hollywood, burning in the hate of its own fandom, where now the only thing that connects the Star Wars fans is that they all hate Star Wars.
Let the hate flow through you.
How did we get here? How has such a loved and commercially successful franchise got to this point? And it's with that said, I welcome you to the world of the Datatainer, where we look to go beyond the headlines and take an analytical look at popular culture with data and observation, classifying scenes, narrative arcs, and connections, and visualizing them. In this respect, my goal is not to give a review of content, but instead an analysis, with the goal to better understand why content is embraced by audiences or not. And to bring us, the audience, together with the studios, to look side by side at objective observations of what types of experiences are more enjoyed than others, and why that might be the case. And in doing so, to try and move away from opinion and the us versus them standoff that serves neither the audience nor the people that want to make movies they want to see. So, if you're looking for another video about Star Wars pointing the finger of blame at ideology and the Hollywood Illuminati, you're in the wrong place. If you're still here, then buckle up for a data-fueled ride into why the Star Wars sequels failed and what Lucasfilm can learn from this to win back audiences and bring Star Wars back to its once totemic popularity. Let's start with some facts about the performance of the sequels. Are they really in fact failures? If we look at the box office total for the sequels across the three movies, it's undeniable they have made a lot of money. According to the numbers, a box office online database, the sequels have raked in a total worldwide gross of $4.46 billion, in excess of the $4 billion Disney paid to acquire Lucasfilm. But success is relative when, as Disney, you've paid the $4 billion to acquire the Star Wars IP, you want as big a return as possible on your investment. And it's in the box office drops in the sequel trilogy we see a subpar performance versus what preceded them. When we compare the drop from the last trilogy of movies, the prequels, the percentage decline from The Phantom Menace to Revenge of the Sith was 17%. The sequel trilogy drop was by comparison a more precipitous 48% from The Force Awakens to The Rise of Skywalker. In fact, the gross of The Rise of Skywalker is so low that it's nearly the same gross of Rogue One. And while Rogue One was critically well received, the culmination of the Skywalker saga, matching the performance of a spin-off movie, is likely not the level of success Disney were hoping for. So, what might Disney have expected to make from the theatrical box office of The Rise of Skywalker? Well, if we run a thought experiment and project the prequel's drop of -17% from the $2 billion worldwide gross of The Force Awakens, we see that they may have reasonably hoped for an extra $700 million. That's $700 million of additional revenue just matching the performance of what they acquired in the prequels. And the audience enjoyment ratings provide another signal of the relatively lower success of the sequel trilogy. If we look at the IMDb ratings of each movie, we see a sharp contrast between the prequels and the sequels, one where the enjoyment increases over time for the prequels and decreases for the sequels. We can also look at the relationship between audience enjoyment ratings and box office performance in another way. When we look at the differences in performance for the second and third movie in each trilogy versus its respective first movie, with audience ratings on the vertical and box office decline on the horizontal, we can see a relationship between the two outcomes, and how the sequels in yellow squandered the goodwill and enjoyment of its first movie in The Force Awakens, while by comparison the prequels did a better job at retaining both enjoyment levels and box office receipts. There are also reports in the trade press and forums that other revenue streams that should be driven by the sequels are not exactly in rude health, with merchandise sales in question and the reports that the Galactic Star Cruiser Hotel will close after costing a reported $1 billion to produce. So, based on objective data of box office takings, audience enjoyment, and reports of low interest in merchandise and park attractions, we can see signals that the sequels are not as successful as what has preceded them, and as a result can be considered relatively as failures. With their relative failure established, the question now is why are the sequels a failure for Lucasfilm and Disney? As I touched on earlier, there is a pervading narrative from some YouTubers and cultural commentators that it's the outcome of focusing more on a message than entertainment. That in the case of the Star Wars sequels, the Force is female. And in Rey, we have a character that personifies a message of positive female representation at the expense of good quality entertainment. Now, as the Datatainer, I'm not here to challenge or defend that analysis, but I will say that the accusation and defense leads us down a road to nowhere. One where the audience is the adversary of the people who make the movies and content we want to enjoy. And I think there's a more helpful, a more nuanced way to look at why the sequels were less enjoyed and successful. And this is in the way of data and observation, examining scene by scene analysis, classifying the type of scene, the elements included, which characters featured, for how long in seconds, to what type of outcome. And the scope of what I've deconstructed is focused on the Skywalker saga movies across the originals, the prequels, and the sequels. This is over 900 unique scenes or sequences and 19,000 data points across the 9 movies. I've not included Disney Plus episodic content, though I may do this in the future. And the reason for this is consistency of format, an ability to compare objectively to learn about what worked before and what could work in the future. So, by deconstructing in an unbiased and impassioned way the movies and content we watch for fun, and analysing and visualising the patterns that we see, my hope is we can in turn see what we did not see before. And in seeing new things with the way of data, we as audiences can come together with the studio to coalesce on new directions, new experiences that can bring Star Wars back to its once hallowed success and revered and passionate fandom following. So, what do we observe in this scene by scene deconstruction? In this analysis, I will move from the general to the specific. I'll start with the core elements in the movies, before moving to key character arcs, and then to an analysis of specific pivotal moments. And I'll look at all these signals to identify the differences between the trilogies, concluding why the sequels are relatively less successful for Star Wars and what the studio can do to improve the movies they produce in the future. Starting with the general elements, I classified each scene in the trilogies in terms of percentage runtime and aggregated them. This covered the primary and secondary purpose of a scene. Was it to deliver action, exposition, humour, a backstory, a flashback, a moment of transformation, or another element? So, what do we observe when we aggregate the use of these elements across the trilogies? Here, I visualised and colour coded the percentage time each element is used per trilogy, with a larger space representing a higher percentage of time used. At first glance, we see a lot of similarities across the trilogies. A similar proportion of time is taken for action and general exposition, so the audience knows what is happening and why. Based on these building blocks, if there was a prescribed alchemy to Star Wars success, the sequels are broadly following it. But part of the enjoyment of Star Wars is also in the fun and light moments, and it's here we start to see some divergence from the sequels to what has preceded them. Firstly, there's more funny moments in general in the sequels, comprising 13% of runtime, where it served as the primary purpose versus 9% for the originals and just 2% for the prequels. In essence, the sequels assign more primary time to humour than the previous trilogies. And it's with this observation we can consider the Disney effect at play in the end audience experience. This is not on the face of it a bad thing, with a studio looking to provide a fun experience to what we assume they were targeting as a general mass audience, including young children and families. And we've also seen a recognition of wanting to appeal to a younger family audience in the prequels, with the fandom maligned character of Jar Jar Binks. So this is not new or the preserve of the sequels. But it's the extent to which the sequels lean into this fun and light-hearted humour that I think creates a balance shift and moves away from the essence of Star Wars. Yes, there were moments of fun and humour in the previous trilogies, but this was never at the expense of the story and what the characters needed to do. When all is said and done, in each trilogy, the fate of the galaxy is at stake, and the lives of billions of beings across thousands of planets. And this brings us to the type of humour tonally we see in the sequels and how it diverges from the originals and the prequels. When we look at the top 10 scenes per trilogy in terms of the percentage of runtime that include humour, we start to see a pattern. In the originals, the humour George Lucas delivered was mainly geared to provide levity to more serious moments, and in general, the droids of C-3PO and R2-D2 were the source of this comedic relief. They're used to good effect to lighten the mood, but still leave the key characters to deal with the serious situation they face. 2 of the top 3 scenes in the originals by time spent that included humour involve C-3PO. The first, at 4% of total runtime in Return of the Jedi, where in a tense negotiation between Jabba the Hutt and a bounty hunter we later discover is Leia, he naively translates to Jabba that the bounty hunter wants 50,000, no less, for the reward for capturing Chewbacca, to which he hits C-3PO in anger and makes him fall from his platform. The second is a scene in Return of the Jedi at 3% of runtime, where having been captured by the Ewoks and believed to be a god, he says to Han Solo it would not be proper to use his divine influence. R2-D2 also has his moments, the longest at 3% of runtime in A New Hope, when he won't play the message of Leia to Luke. And it's in Han Solo we have the longest runtime of a scene including humour in the originals, in Return of the Jedi at 5%, where during his rescue from Jabba the Hutt's pleasure barge, he gives Jabba his response to an invitation to ask for mercy. It's in these moments we see a recognition from George Lucas of the need to punctuate serious, at times life and death moments with moments of levity and humanity. Be this the slapstick humour or cowardice of a droid, or despite an outward exterior of a confident leader, the need for reassurance from those around him. And in the prequels we see a similar approach, only here it is transferred from the droids to the Anakin and Obi-Wan relationship. The top examples in the prequels based on runtime are when Obi-Wan chastises Anakin in Attack of the Clones while they chase Zen, or when he tells Anakin the shields are up when they are flying to rescue Palpatine from Count Dooku and General Grievous. Obi-Wan also has his own moments with his now iconic and memed scene in Revenge of the Sith.
Hello there.
And Mace Windu tops the charts on runtime in scenes with humour in his entrance at the Battle of Geonosis.
This party's over.
Like with the originals, they are all near enough. Moments that bring levity to otherwise serious and life-threatening moments, to keep the balance of fun and peril for the audience. But in the sequels, we not only see more time allocated to humour, but tonally a different way in which it is used. In the sequels, it's the antagonists that are the main source of humour and fun for the audience. The top scene in terms of runtime that includes humour is the Dreadnought bombing in The Last Jedi, where Poe calls Hux from his X-Wing. It's a genuine attempt at humour and may have made some people laugh, but it created a problem for the character of Hux and the movie as a whole. Hux was set up in The Force Awakens to be a feared and treacherous general, full of hate, anger, and ambition. Yet in these moments, he's a figure of fun, to be laughed at rather than feared. Can you imagine Admiral Tarkin having this kind of conversation? Or even taking Poe's call?
I think you overestimate their chances.
Kylo Ren is also a source of humour. The top moments for him are in The Last Jedi, where he asks for more firepower on the speeders, and Hux repeats his request. And in his exchanges with Luke in The Last Jedi before their lightsaber duel.
I'm sure you are!
This kind of line sets up Kylo as a childish brat, a rebellious teen, again to laugh at, rather than a Sith Lord and Dark Force user to fear. Can you imagine a situation with Darth Vader where we would feel this, where another character pokes fun at him with a quip or he loses his cool to comedic effect? I don't think you can, and that's somewhat the point. In the originals and prequels, the antagonists were feared. They created tension and presented challenges for the protagonist to overcome. In the sequels, they're more a source of fun. Moving away from humour, another departure for the sequels is there's generally less time spent travelling across the galaxy than in the originals and the prequels. This represents the lack of evolution in the sequels from a world-building perspective. The characters travel to fewer planets and worlds in the sequels, and even the planets they visit, we feel like we may have been there before in previous trilogies, or they feel very familiar. Like Jakku being a second Tatooine, Crate being a version of Hoth, with the script in the movie even feeling the need to signal it's a different place.
Salt.
So what we see in the time spent on these elements of a movie experience is, on the one hand, similarities in action and exposition, but on the other hand, more use of humour, which is used less to provide levity, but more to poke fun at and undermine the antagonists that we should fear and should create tension and peril for the hero. And generally less travel, and by extension world building and expansion of the Star Wars universe, instead reimagining what was already there. With this general perspective in hand, let's now take a step further and look at the data and observations related to the protagonists and antagonists. The heroes and villains of the Star Wars saga, the people we root for and want to succeed, and the evil ones we fear and at times are drawn to and want to better understand. Every great story has a protagonist an audience can root for and connect with. Someone who gets in the middle of circumstances or a situation bigger than themselves, who fails and suffers, yet through sheer grit and determination does things they thought they never could, to overcome these obstacles and save the day. Now, at this point, it's well-trodden ground to accuse Rey as the source of the failure of the Star Wars sequels, with the accusation being that she's a Mary Sue, a type of female character who is depicted as unrealistically lacking in flaws or weaknesses, an author's idealised self-insertion, a form of wish fulfillment, an unrealistically capable and virtuous character, one who simply lacks flaws and is depicted in an overly positive light. In this definition, we do see the antithesis of what is typically considered a good protagonist or hero, someone who has flaws, overcomes obstacles, and goes through pain and suffering to become a stronger, better person. So what can we observe about Rey to question or support this Mary Sue accusation, and how might this link to the relatively weaker success of the sequels? Let's start with how well liked Rey is relative to Luke and Anakin, our other key protagonists. In this survey data from Morning Consult, we see that Rey has the least favourable rating, lower than Luke, lower than Anakin. So if Rey is less liked by the audience, why might this be the case? We can look for the answer to this question in how many successes and failures she has in the sequels versus Luke and Anakin in their respective trilogies. These will be represented by scenes in green and red colours, with the size of the scene representing the percentage of time in the movie. We will also look at moments of self-doubt in orange and pain and suffering in black. What challenges does she overcome relative to Luke and Anakin, and how does this shape her character to achieve the success she does? In doing this, we will have before us a DNA fingerprint for Rey, Luke and Anakin, the DNA of a hero, if you will. So let's dive in and start with Luke as a reference point in terms of the DNA of a liked hero in the Star Wars saga, starting with Episode 4, A New Hope. In this movie, we see a failure early on and in his first action encounter, when he comes up against the Tusken Raiders and gets knocked out unconscious, later to be saved by Obi-Wan. He then has his first moment of pain and suffering when he finds Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru killed by the Empire. This wasn't his personal failure, but it was a tough moment for him, and it triggers his commitment to learning about the Force and becoming a Jedi. After this decision, he recovers well, and after some initial stumbles, learns to deflect the training droid blasts with his lightsaber. But then he's captured in a tractor beam by the Empire. However, after this, he has the courage and agency to suggest Leia's rescue and escapes from the Death Star before destroying it at the Battle of Yavin. So in this first movie for his arc, he faces some obstacles and has some failures, but not too many, and his shot to destroy the Death Star could be considered a Mary Sue moment in of itself. Yes, he bullseyed Womp Rats back home, but not with Vader on his tail in a physically claustrophobic tunnel, possibly flying an X-Wing for the first time in his life. But it's from this point in The Empire Strikes Back that things don't go so well for Luke, and he faces bigger obstacles to overcome, in which he fails rather miserably. From start to end, things aren't great for Luke, and any moments of success, if you want to call them that, are when he's rescued by his friends rather than anything he did himself. At the start, he's captured by the Wampa, and yes, he does well to escape, but would have been frozen to death had Han not saved him. At the Battle of Hoth, he loses his gunner, crashes his airspeeder, and despite recovering by destroying the attack with his lightsaber and thermal detonator, the battle overall is a failure. Then, after he gets Yoda to agree to train him, he cannot believe how he lifted his X-Wing from the swamp. Then he leaves, not completing his training, takes on Vader to save his friends, and ends up having his hand cut off and discovering the Sith Lord he was training to kill was his father. It's a wake-up call, a reality check that life often hits you in the face with. It's something that many of us can relate to. Sometimes life hits us with something we don't expect, and we have to learn from it and move on. We think we can do things and succeed, but it's only when we fail that we get better and we can really do them. After these failures, he comes back in The Return of the Jedi, stronger, battle-hardened and more successful, but not without failure. He starts off well, saving Han. He takes on the stormtroopers on Endor with, in my opinion, one of the coolest lightsaber moments in the whole saga, and uses the Force to win over the Ewoks. But then he fails. He fails to convince Vader to turn back to the light and is then goaded into fighting Vader by Palpatine. He then recovers by refusing to continue the fight with Vader, and in that moment, he realizes the meaning of Yoda's words in his training on Dagobah.
Wars not make one great.
He uses his mind rather than his lightsaber, and is at peace before then being tortured by Palpatine's Force lightning and being rescued by Vader, redeeming him in the process. Put bluntly, he is put through the ringer. He suffers, he grows, and in the end, he wins. And it's across these moments we see a narrative fingerprint, a DNA print of a hero. one with a balance of success and failure, moments of pain and suffering, and in the end, an arc where his final victory means something to the audience. And what of Luke's father, Anakin? We saw earlier he is less liked than Luke as a character, but still more so than Rey. Anakin progresses through a longer time cycle than Luke or Rey. He grows from a young boy to an adolescent learning his craft, and then a young man at the peak of his powers. Yet his arc is quite similar to his son until his end in the final act. In The Phantom Menace, like Luke, we see a few moments of failure, though it takes until the second half of the movie for the first when the Jedi refuse to train him, before, like his son, he contributes to the destruction of a space station to win the day. Mary Sue accusations have been made online about this series of successes, that in nearly everything he does, this young boy succeeds, in time at improbable moments. But like Luke, it's in the second act where things take a turn for the worse for Anakin. After a first successful mission finding Zen, moments later she's killed by Jango Fett, and things go downhill from there. We see Anakin go through a dark period of pain and suffering, one where he fails to save his mother, and he proclaims he will be the most powerful Jedi ever. But, like Luke, he loses his lightsaber duel, in this case to Count Dooku, and has his arm cut off for good measure.
Again, it's like poetry, sort of they rhyme.
And it's in the third act, in Revenge of the Sith, at the beginning we see a similar arc to Luke, where Anakin comes back stronger, where at first he leads a rescue mission, and then gets success when Palpatine chooses him to be on the Jedi Council. But after this success, things take a turn. He is not granted the rank of Jedi Master, he is not chosen for the mission to kill Grievous, he finds out Palpatine is Sidious and reports this to Mace Windu. But despite this, is not trusted to join the battle, and then we think he kills Mace Windu. From this point, and in his transformation to Darth Vader, he succeeds in the Jedi Temple storming, and completes his mission to kill the Separatist Council members on Mustafar. But then he reaches the depths of failure and suffering. He loses to Obi-Wan through arrogance and rage, despite being at the peak of his powers, goes through the pain and suffering of being burnt on Mustafar, operated on, and then in the ultimate failure he becomes Vader, losing his physical adeptness and skill with his saber, before going through the emotional pain of believing he killed the person he turned to the dark side to save. It is one of the most tragic ends to a protagonist, and perhaps the ultimate failure and pain any Star Wars character has endured. With both Luke and Anakin, we can then see bright beginnings, peppered with obstacles in the first act, dark moments of pain and failure in the second act, before one trusts in the light in the third act and succeeds, and the other turns to the dark and fails. But one way or the other, what we see is strength emerging from failure, pain and suffering. So, now to Rey, a less liked character and linked to a relatively less successful set of movies. What do we see in her DNA? Starting with The Force Awakens, we see a good balance of failure and success. It is, however, somewhat front-loaded with success, where in the first hour of the movie, she saves BB-8 from Tito despite him being on horseback with a superior weapon, overpowers a group of thugs when they try to take BB-8, pilots the Falcon with no knowledge of its controls and presumably having never piloted a spacecraft before, saves Finn from a Rathtar closing the doors at the exact time to kill it, fixes the Falcon with no knowledge of its inner workings when Han couldn't work it out, on a ship he had off and on spent possibly 2 decades piloting. It's quite a series of successes in number and range, but it is then tempered by her reluctance to touch Luke's saber and her first encounter with Kylo Ren, who completely controls her into reaching the outcome he wants. However, we're then back to a series of successes where she starts to use the Force and she reads Kylo's mind. This is without any training or knowledge of how to do this, mentally overpowering a Sith Force user we assumed was trained since he was a young boy. uses a mind trick to escape from the stormtroopers again without any training or guidance, somehow finds a lever to escape when scaling a wall, and somehow finds a switch to open the door to the shield generator with Han and Chewbacca. If we compare this to Luke, his first visible use of the Force comes after 122 minutes in the second movie, where he reaches for his lightsaber to kill the Wampa. One would think after months of self-training and focus, not within minutes of someone trying to use the Force to read your mind. This is then punctuated by a failure when Han dies. And while she is not responsible for this, we can consider it as a failure because she watched on while Kylo Ren ran him through with his saber. Then we get to the finale, where she bests Kylo Ren in a lightsaber duel. To say this is an improbable outcome would be kind. Yes, Kylo was hurt by the blaster shot from Chewbacca, but it is improbable she would best a seasoned Sith Force user the first time that she picked one up. So here we see an inconclusive picture. On the one hand, some moments of failure, on the other, a series of successes that are quite improbable for someone with no experience or training in the Force or knowledge of spacecraft. But it's in Rey's second act the picture becomes clearer. We saw with Luke and Anakin the second act is typically one of failure, pain and suffering, or both. So what happens with Rey in the second act? After one failure to get Luke to train her, we see a series of unpunctuated successes, a sea of green. No, not that stuff, this stuff. A series of events that confirm her existing power and strength, rather than presenting obstacles for her to grit her teeth through to gain that strength. From the point of Luke refusing to train her, she manages to recover and get him to agree to teach her 3 lessons that he believes will dissuade her from wanting to become a Jedi, but she ends up endearing him to her so he sees himself in her. She then beats Luke in a fight, decides that she will turn Kylo back to the light for reasons we don't know. Unlike Luke, who had a connection to his father, she had little motivation to turn to Kylo. She is intentionally taken into custody, like Luke in Return of the Jedi, but without a reason to believe the outcome could be positive. She fights Snoke's guards with Kylo and wins. She pilots the Falcon in the Battle of Crate and draws away TIE fighters, giving the Resistance fighters time to regroup in the cave. And she somehow knows where to find the Resistance survivors and rescues them by moving a pile of rocks, with just one experience with Luke moving stones with her hand. In fact, this series of successes is only punctuated with a single moment, not of failure but of pain and suffering, where Snoke tortures her mind. This was one of 2 moments I could find across all 3 movies where she experienced pain or suffering. This and a moment when her arm is hit by one of Snoke's guards. That is it. And how does that compare to Luke and Anakin? So, less a period of failure and pain for Rey, where she becomes battle-hardened to gain strength, and more a series of events that demonstrate the strength she has. So how does this conclude in the third act for Rey? Does she go through a series of challenges and pain and grow as a person and Force user to then save the galaxy? In short, no. Well, for the challenges and pain bit at least. In the third act, The Rise of Skywalker, we again see a lot of successes and few failures, and moments of pain and suffering. But the moments we do see are interesting, and I think a recognition from Lucasfilm that they needed to temper Rey's strength and power to get the audience to connect more with her. We see in the first half of the movie a series of moments that feel somewhat inserted into the story to meet that purpose, rather than adding to the story or her character arc, which by this point of the third movie really cannot be recovered. At the start of the movie, she shows impatience to complete her training with Leia and questions if she really is as great as everyone thinks she is. And later she doubts she may turn to the dark side as Kylo predicts. These moments, as I said, feel somewhat inserted, that they're designed to create empathy with her, but it's difficult at this point given how well everything has gone for her until now. She also kills Chewbacca in a second failure, but with Rey, the failure is the result of her growing power rather than the result of a lack of skill or respect for an enemy. In this encounter, she still overpowers Kylo Ren, and it's only her lack of control that leads to failure. And preceding this, she managed to jump midair and destroy his TIE fighter in a move beyond anything we've seen from a Force user in the Skywalker saga. And it's in these pivotal moments of conflict and combat across the sequel movies we see that Rey is more successful than her antagonist of Kylo Ren, and indeed more successful than the other protagonists of Luke and Anakin. If as a reference point we look at Luke, we see more successes than failures when in combat, but there is generally a balance. And this is represented by his duels with Darth Vader, where in his first duel he loses the fight and a hand, and in the second he comes back stronger and overpowers him. Then with Anakin we see more successes than there being no winner or a failure, but still failure, with his first lightsaber duel with Count Dooku the most notable. With Rey, she is involved in 20 combat scenes across the three movies, either hand-to-hand combat with a lightsaber, shooting with blasters, or spacecraft battles. And there is not one occasion where she loses, not one occasion where she fails. So in the combat moments, in pivotal moments of growth for a protagonist, we see another signal of the display of strength and growth, rather than failure that enables growth to reach strength. And back to our timeline and the Force Lightning ship destruction. From then on, there is one moment of pain and suffering for Rey, which to be fair is when she dies. But it's somewhat negated by the fact that within seconds, Kylo Ren, now Ben Solo, uses the new Force healing power that he never knew he had, likely somehow by osmosis taken from Rey, who also discovered it without knowing she had it. And then of course comes the finale. Not one where Luke throws away his saber and realizes the true meaning of being a Jedi, not one where we see Anakin's tragic downfall, but this. Never before has there been such a triumphant moment for a Star Wars protagonist. It's a moment in many ways that symbolizes Rey's power and seeming lack of challenge to achieve her goals. And it's when we compare her DNA print to Luke and Anakin across their respective trilogies that we see quite instantly how successful Rey is. Here we can look at the DNA data another way. Instead of a left to right timeline, we can consider each classified scene as a block, a step, where the grey moments are ones of indifference and the character remains static, the green moments of success that they move up, and the red moments of failure, black moments of pain and suffering, and orange moments of self-doubt where they go down. So what does looking at the data in this way reveal? Starting with Luke, we can see what can be considered a typical arc of a hero, someone who suffers setbacks and challenges, though in learning to overcome them becomes stronger and wins in the end. Anakin has a different arc, one where he ends in Revenge of the Sith somewhat where he started, as a slave. At the start he is a slave to Watto on Tatooine, and at the end he is a slave to Palpatine, encased in the metal prison of his suit as Vader. With Anakin there is no win at the end, but only tragedy. And with Rey, what arc do we see? Well, a rather steep one of progression and success. More than her mentor Luke, and more than even Anakin, the chosen one, according to Dave Filoni, the most powerful Jedi ever. And maybe the steepness of this arc is the central problem that we need to rethink about Rey. She is not less liked as a character necessarily because she is a Mary Sue or because she is female, but because based on the balance of success versus failure and pain and suffering, Rey is actually akin to an action hero, not a Jedi. Please indulge me in this comparison. You remember those action movies with stars like Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Bruce Willis? We love them, each in their own way. The confidence, the bravado, the way in which they overcame any situation. And we always knew at the start of the movie that there was never a chance they would meet a sticky end. Never a moment the villain would overcome them. And this is the problem with Rey and the sequel trilogy more generally. That in Rey we have the insertion of an action hero from a bygone era. Someone who cannot be hurt, cannot fail, and will always win the day. She just happens to be female. And with the action hero as a protagonist rather than a Jedi, we see the real problem with the sequel trilogy, one that overlooks the real essence of Star Wars, the Force. The way it connects the characters, that it pulls some to the light with their willingness to discover, to train, to suffer and to learn, and how it seduces and pulls some to the dark through fear, anger and hatred. It is this connection, this battle between good and evil between characters and within their minds, that we see a key reason why Star Wars has endured, and why, based on the observation of the character arcs across the trilogies, why I believe refocusing on the Force, its connection between good and evil, and the internal battle in each character is what will lead to its recovery. It doesn't matter what gender, race, skin colour or species a Star Wars protagonist is, only that we join their journey in connecting to the Force and how they overcome the obstacles, challenges, pain and suffering that it takes to become a Jedi, or how they succumb to the fear, anger and hatred of the dark side. And so, if this is the path to elevate Star Wars back to its once celebrated position with audiences, what have the spin-off movies and episodic content on Disney Plus done to make this start? I've not deconstructed this content, so I can't provide you with data, but let me give you an anecdotal observation. What we have been served since as an audience remains, on the one hand, a polarization of continued action hero protagonists, characters that cannot and do not fail. On the other hand, we've had welcome echoes of the past, with new moments that personally meant a lot to me. The return of Luke in The Mandalorian, the moment where Vader switches between the voice we knew in Anakin and Vader's through his mask, Vader in Anakin's form fighting Ahsoka, and of course, Vader going beast mode in Rogue One. But as much as I enjoyed these moments, they are not an evolution or continuation of the essence of what Star Wars is. Now, in a lot of respects, I can't blame Disney and Lucasfilm for where they are today. Disney bought an IP in Star Wars that they needed to monetize, and Lucasfilm executed to that commercial strategy. But we've seen the execution has been imbalanced and moved away from what at least I feel is the real essence of Star Wars. So with these observations and conclusions in hand, I don't want to dwell on the past, but instead look to the future. One that returns to the essence of Star Wars and light and dark side characters connected and in conflict around the energy of the Force. And to do that, I think now is the time to step away from the Skywalker saga. To break away from the duality of, on the one hand, the insertion of the action hero trope, and on the other hand, bringing back loved and meaningful characters from another era. Now, I'm not suggesting to kill the past as Kylo did, but to move on from it with confidence that instead it's the Force and the world building and what George Lucas created that separates Star Wars from any other movie franchise. Everything else is likely to be throwaway content that will be forgotten the day after it's seen. The theme park rides that Scorsese warned us against. But where should Disney and Lucasfilm look if they are to chart this new course, to create new worlds and Force users, to evolve the Star Wars universe while retaining its essence? Well, Based on the data and deconstruction, we see that, to put it lightly, a new Rey movie may not be the answer. And again, this is not because of her gender, but because her action hero character arc has not helped to build an audience. So it's a question, for me at least, as to why Lucasfilm believe she as a character is the conduit to rebuild the franchise. Instead, they need to think differently and start with us, the audience, by focusing less on what the Star Wars fandom hates and more on what they create. Star Wars has inspired possibly the highest volume of fan fiction of any franchise in history, with hundreds of short films published freely to audiences on YouTube and screened in convention. Some are amateur productions, some more professional from fledgling filmmakers. Some come from a motivation to showcase skill for career progression, others from sheer love for the franchise, but all live and die by the audience they attract. And so it's to the audience response of fan fiction that we turn in our next video, where I deconstruct over 100 fan fiction movies to identify what audiences want to see in Star Wars and how what we see in this fan fiction galaxy may very well be the place Lucasfilm need to look to recover and bring Star Wars back to its previous heights. If you'd like to check out that video, please subscribe to the channel, and please let me know what you've thought of this video in the comments. Any support you give, either through liking this video or subscribing, will help keep alive the mission to deconstruct popular culture with data and observation to improve it for us all. I thank you for watching, and until I see you again, remember, with the way of data and observation, we can save entertainment.